that he made via online Sunday, as it is. And it's the verse in 1 Corinthians 9:27, and he made the point, the RSV, instead of, most of the translations are, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection. I think New American Standard is something along the lines of I discipline strongly or greatly, somewhat emphasizes it. The RSV is I pummel my body. It's literally the word for basically to punch under the eye is what the word literally is. And we'll say this, and I felt like I didn't do a good job of explaining it Sunday and wanted to revisit it. And we'll simply ask this. What is the greatest battle anybody in here will ever face? And the question is, the greatest battle with whom? And it's ourselves. And that's ultimately, it's like, that is the context. As much as we would like to say, well, this is all about liberties, what it's really all about is self-denial. Right? That's what it is. That's what liberties are about. It's about self-denial, denying ourselves for the sake of others. So when Paul is talking about it, and we think about the fight, and we think about the race that we're running, and we think about the competition, and ultimately it's ourselves, that we're doing battle with ourselves, that we're denying ourselves. And that's where very often, of course, where the battle is lost, frankly, that it's real easy to look. I was talking, Brace, was it me and you and I who were talking Sunday, and we're talking about how could you read this chapter and still believe in once saved, always saved? And we're just making the point about how could you read Scripture, and it's so easy to see things and, oh, I know, it was the conversation about the Pharisee and the woman, that the Pharisee was fully aware of her sins, as she was too, and that it is so easy to see when someone else is struggling. It's so easy to see when someone else has a speck in their eye. It's the beam in our eye. It's where the battle is very often lost. But I wanted to go back and just make that point, just so we didn't miss it, and I appreciated Greg mentioning that verse Sunday. Does anyone have any questions or comments about that chapter before we get fully into chapter 10? Yeah, go ahead, Brace.
The other point I was going to make about the disciplining your body thing was, I don't know that it necessarily originated here, but the Gnostics very much practiced self-asceticism, where they actually physically did things to their body as a means of denying themselves the baser pleasures of the flesh. And that certainly is not what Paul is talking about here. In fact, he addresses it. I believe it's in Colossians chapter 2. He talks about that a little bit.
Yeah.
But the point is, I mean, this discipline that he is doing is not a physical harm to his body. It's simply exercising the self-control. He just uses really strong language to show us how important it is. It's kind of like Jesus does in a lot of places. Matthew 5 comes to mind with, if your right eye offends you, pluck it out and cast it from you. I mean, he's not literally telling us to cut our eyeball out.
He's talking about the same thing.
He's dealing with the same idea. He uses really strong language in order to impress upon us the significance of what he's talking about.
Yeah. It occurs to me as you were talking there at the tail end, just how, to use the race metaphor, can you imagine the idea, and the verse that Brace mentioned, this is Colossians chapter 2, verse 23, these things indeed have an appearance of wisdom and self-imposed religion, false humility, and neglect of the body, but are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh. What Paul's talking about in the Corinthian passage and what the Lord's talking about, we're talking about disciplining ourselves for the sake of others. It's not just disciplining ourselves for the sake of self-discipline. We're not masochists. We're not denying ourselves just for the sake of denial. We're thinking about others. And now, to get into the race metaphor, or to get into the picture of the boxing metaphor, can you imagine disciplining yourself so that someone else could win? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine actually going slower in a race so that someone else could keep up with you or could even surpass. That idea of helping others, of denying yourself for others. That's what we're talking about. It's not self-denial just for the sake of self-denial. Starts going against the grain of God has created all things to be enjoyed, and we're thankful for them. Why did Paul deny himself having a wife? He did it for others. Why did he deny himself monetarily, not taking support from certain places? He did it for them. Why does he say, all these things he's thinking about others? It's not just for the sake of self-denial. Self-denial in and of itself, if you're not thinking about others, and this goes back to podcast from a week or two ago, if you're not doing it for others, then why are you doing it? And if this is just self-flagellation, if this is just self-punishment, that's also a form of selfishness. You're effectively turning it towards it's all about you. Anyway, okay, anything else? All right, come on to 1 Corinthians 10. And we'll go ahead and read a little bit. Chapter 10, verse 1, we read it Sunday, but that's all right. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. The Lord was with them every step of the way. When they're coming out of Egypt, I've always thought it was interesting when the Lord talks about what you should not worry about, right? He says, don't worry about what you eat, don't worry about what you drink, don't worry about what you wear, right? For is life not more than clothing? When they came out of Egypt, did the Lord feed them? Yep. Did they have drink? They drank from that rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. We'll talk about that here in a second. And what about their clothing? It did not wear out. It's like the Lord provided for them, and yet when the time comes to, as you have Joshua and Caleb and the other spies, and they return from the promised land, spying out the promised land, and 10 of them, what do they say? Oh, we just can't do it. And it's like, here's my 30-second rant. Right? They saw, did they actually see Jericho when those spies went out? Does anybody remember? Was it actually Jericho they saw, or was it just elsewhere in Canaan? Anyway, what do you think, whatever they saw, how do you think it compared with the power of the day being Egypt? Pyramids, Pharaoh, the supply cities. How do you think whatever they saw up in Canaan, how do you think it compared with Egypt? Which one do you think was more impressive? All those Canaanites up there, all those folks doing whatever they're doing from a worldly perspective. Which one was more impressive, Canaan or Egypt? And what does God do with Egypt? It's like they had seen, and let me just ask it this way, and I know I'm over my 30-second window. How hard was it for God to destroy Egypt? It's like, it's not hard. It's a city on a river, and right out of the gate, what does he do to the lifeblood of the city? It's done. At that point, it's just a waiting game. Of course, the Lord's not at that point, he's not in the waiting business. So then we're going to move on to the frogs, we're going to move on to the lice, we're going to move on to the flies, we're going to go all the way down to the death of the firstborn. It's like, it's done. And yet when the spies go up to Canaan, they come back and they say, oh, we're not sure if we can do that. Have faith. Have faith and have some godly reverence and some fear. The Lord had been with them, but then, of course, we know what happens. Verse 5, with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. I wanted to go back and I wanted to look at some of these references. And with that first one, that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Most commentators think that refers to Numbers 11. I want you to come back to Numbers 11. And I want you to see some of the things that are mentioned in Numbers chapter 11. This is verse 1. Numbers 11 verse 1 says, "Now when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. So he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. Now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving." So the children, I think that's where other versions might actually use the word greed. Is that what?
Desire.
Greedy desire. And that's why most folks think that it is, Corinthians uses the word lusting after evil things. I think some of the versions use the word lust back in Numbers, but it's the mixed multitude who are among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely," and on and on and on. And needless to say, we know what happens. The reason I wanted to read that is because of verse 4. Did that mixed multitude have a good effect on Israel? And I wanted you to see that idea. Because we've already dealt in Corinthians, as you think about the idea of how the worldly can affect, and we've already dealt with some of that in talking about, when we talked about marriage and things like that. All right, the next one in Corinthians is verse 7, "And do not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." In that passage, that's at Sinai, is where that reference is, and we have the quotation there, so we know that one for sure. And you might remember they come to Aaron, and for one thing, later on, when Moses comes down the mountain and Moses confronts Aaron, and it says, "For Aaron had not restrained the people." So what should Aaron have done? When they come to him and they say, "Hey, make us an idol," you know what Aaron should have said? "Get lost." He's coming back down the mountain. Moses is coming back down the mountain. Just look up on top of Mount Sinai, and what do you see? You see the thunderings, you see the rumblings, you see everything being on fire, and you're going to have the audacity to come to me and you want me to make an idol. Well, Aaron ends up making it. But then what he does, when you go back and read the account, after he makes it, he tells Israel, he says, "Tomorrow is a feast day to the Lord." And he uses that word Lord there. And it's like, what's going on here? And it makes you wonder a little bit. In the outline, simply make the point that, and it's the same point that the Corinthians needed to understand. You don't get to worship God on Sunday and then worship an idol on Monday. That's not how this works. You don't get to worship God like the pagans worship their gods, right? The whole idea of don't make an idol, right? Don't bow down to an idol. That's the idea, that God was not going to be worshiped that way. Aaron needed to restrain the people. Now, was idolatry having an effect on the Corinthians? Right? And it's the same stuff in here you go. Here's the synopsis. The same thing that Israel had trouble with repeatedly, what are the Corinthians having trouble with? The same thing. And Paul's like, guys, please learn from what happened to them, because how many of them got into the promised land? Not many. With most of them, God was not well pleased. All right, verse 8, "Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell." It's from the account, that's from the account of Balaam. And we see how God's people were turned to sin. And I referenced Numbers 28 and Revelation 2 as well in that passage. When you go back and you read the account of Balaam, because Balaam, what was the king who Balaam was dealing with? Balak. And wants Balaam to curse Israel. And I assure you, Balaam, it turns out, he ends up blessing Israel, but I assure you, it's not because he wants to. He really doesn't. But the very next chapter, you can tell, the question is, how are we going to bring Israel down? And to put it in a nutshell, it looks like Balaam's answer is intermarriage. If we can get them with our daughters, then we've got them. And that's what ends up happening. Go ahead, Kurt.
When the people rose up and feasted after they made the golden image, what did they eat?
What were they eating?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead if you...
Well, wouldn't it have been manna? Were they still being fed of the manna at that point?
Well, I mean, if we're talking Sinai, we're talking real early. Had the manna even begun yet? And I'm asking, I really don't.
Unless they brought provisions with them.
Had the manna already begun? Okay, Brace is saying the manna has already begun.
I was thinking they were eating manna at that point.
Okay.
And my point is, they rose up and feasted on manna.
Right.
Okay, but the issue was not the appetite of their belly, it was the appetite of their eye. When you look at the account in Numbers 11, what they complained about is that when we were back in Egypt, we had the fish and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and all this good stuff.
Yeah.
And they say, our appetite's gone, we got nothing to look at. In verse 6, at least two translations say, we got nothing to look at. Okay, the problem was it wasn't appealing on the plate. It didn't make a pretty picture. Right. Our family takes pictures of food and sends it together all the time.
I've heard.
You've heard. We taunt each other with the meals that we make and say, look how appetizing. You can't taste over the picture. And everyone responds with, oh man, that looks so good, I want that, and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Their appetite was in their eye. And when you talk about the parallel that's being used in 1 Corinthians, it's looking at Israel, or it's Israel, spiritual Israel, looking at metaphorical Egypt and saying, doesn't their plate look better than ours? It's the people that can rise up and they can feast on the manna, but what they're seeing when they're doing that is the idols of those around them instead of God and His glory. So it's two examples, even though it's food and involved in both of them.
Right.
Their belly is not the issue as much as it is their eye. It's their appetite for things that are of the foreign nation, Egypt, or the god that they fashioned, the small g god, G-O-D.
Right.
Their appetite was for the things of nations that didn't belong to God. And that's what Paul is warning them of in 1 Corinthians. It's not the belly.
Right.
It's the appetite for things that are of the other nations. That's what makes that rabble, that mixed multitude, get into such trouble. It's they look backwards in their history, in their lives, in both counts. They had to look back to their days in Egypt to come up with the golden image and to come up with a desire for all of these melons and leeks and whatever.
Yeah, the manna always gets me because is it one of the other accounts where it talks about it being angels' food. And I mean, it didn't look like, yeah, but as it describes it, it talks about them working it into bread and whatnot. And I mean, just as you were talking, I was thinking about in schooling, my school, where, and just think about it this way. We're talking about the difference between those who are impoverished and those who are wealthy. And when you sit down to eat in those two groups, you get very different questions, right? When you are in poverty, the question is, did you get enough to eat? When you're wealthy, the question is, how good was it and what did it look like? How was the presentation? When you're impoverished, do you care about the presentation? No, you need sustenance. Did the Lord sustain them? And yet they're the ones who say, our soul loathes this worthless bread. Then they just loathed it. And then you have Jesus, the true manna, right? The true manna from above. And sadly, folks have no taste for him either. Go ahead, Bryce.
I think Greg nailed something with talking about the idea of them. It was the appetite of their eyes.
Right.
But I'll
Pause
take
for a second there
Go ahead.
before I forget something. I mean, it's like the temples.
Yes.
You know, we know what the temple of Aphrodite looked like. We know what the temple of Apollos looked like. And it's like, where were they meeting? You know, it was just a ragtag bunch of folks. And it goes to that same idea of, oh, I want the big splendorous structure. I want the, what were they sacrificing to their idols? I'm sure it was this massive presentation. And it's, that Christians are called to think about things differently.
Well, and that's where I was going to go was I think not only was it a lusting after the things of the nations, it was literally about what they could see.
Right.
I mean, Moses is gone.
Right.
And whether or not the manifestation of God on the mountain is still there or not, I don't know. But they wanted something they could look at right in front of them. So they have Aaron fashion this idol, and he calls it the Lord. And so it's like a physical manifestation of God, because they want and it's the same thing later with the king. They want someone who can go out before them and come back in with them. God's been doing that all along, but they can't see him.
Right.
And so they want something they can see, something tangible. And these idolaters in Corinth are the same way. They want the big they want the big temples, and they want the idols that they can look at and that they can bow down before, instead of the invisible God that Paul's preaching and proclaiming, who is worshipped in nondescript buildings that don't have any relevance or importance in their society. So, people want the same thing today. They want the big mega churches where, there's splendor and there's elegance and there's glory and all of that, instead of the little simple church building, where all their focus is on worshiping God and worshiping the Lord in the way that he revealed. So people haven't changed.
Here's my question. And I was looking in the numbers 11. When the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp, were they still being guided? And I believe they were, by the pillar of fire. And you're coming out every day except for on Saturday, and you got, can you imagine waking up in the morning and you go out and there's manna all over? All you got to do is go out and pick it up. That's all you got to do. You're being led by the pillar of fire. Now, I don't know about you, but I would be kind of nervous around a pillar of fire. And it looks like in the Numbers 11, I wonder if that's, you better be real careful around the pillar of fire. And it's like, you better be real careful around the cloud. And I do think the Lord was working with them like little kids, and he's trying to bring them along. And they're like, oh, we want to see something. It's like when they come to Jesus, we want to see a sign. Have y'all not been looking? It's like, oh, we want to see something. You are seeing something. You're just ignoring it. Oh, you want to see something else? Okay, you're going to get something else. You want an idol? You got an idol. And at the end of the day, what are you going to have to do with that idol? You're not happy with how the Lord fed you with the manna? Guess what you get to chase that manna down with when Moses is done grinding it up? Guess what? That idol just became your chaser. Drink it. And then the Levites strap on the swords, and then they start killing people. And it's like, man, they had seen stuff, and it's just flabbergasting. What other questions or comments so far? Go ahead, Chuck.
With the account of when they wanted meat and they got the quail.
Yeah.
The quail was like knee high for
Right.
miles in sight,
Right.
and they all gathered it all up, and
Right.
to the
Yeah.
point where they just
Coming out of their nose.
yep.
We want meat. Okay.
Got it.
You got meat. And then how many more died? because of their complaints. That's Numbers 21. That's on the inside front cover. As a side note to all of those, verse 4, and this is strictly as a side note, just because it places Christ there. And that verse shows that Jesus existed before the Word became flesh. That can be helpful when you're studying with certain people who, some folks, they kind of don't believe that Jesus started existing until the incarnation. And this verse clearly shows, as it calls the rock that followed them, the rock that followed them was Christ. That may also, just as you think about some of the symbolism, and you have to be kind of careful with symbolism, especially when Scripture doesn't say it's being symbolic. But what does Moses do with the rock towards the end? Instead of speaking to it, he strikes it. And he does not hallow God in the eyes of Israel. The rock that followed them was who? It was Christ. Anyway, you might consider that idea. So, from the outline, just made the point. So we have this list to look at the examples that Paul pulls from, and he probably could have pulled others. But hopefully we see how the Corinthians were following in Israel's sinful footsteps, and how we, of course, can do the same. That Israel was not content with what God gave them, that Israel was caught up with idolatry and pride, that sexual immorality is going to play a part, testing the Lord, and then complaining. And what was happening in Corinth? It's like the same things. What sort of things are still being dealt with today? And I think it was Joy who made the point a few weeks ago about idolatry is alive and well. Covetousness is called idolatry, and of course the ultimate idol, and we're back to self-denial, because who's the ultimate idol? And it's just like it was in Egypt. Who is the last God that Jehovah judged? It was Pharaoh, right? Because the pharaohs thought that they were gods. So if you're a pharaoh and you think you're a god, then what do you think your son is? Who did the people think Pharaoh's son was? Thought he was deity. And in one fell swoop, what does Jehovah show? I just killed your God. And we're back to the idea, and we think about as an application, that we have to crucify the flesh as it is. We discipline ourselves because we ourselves can ultimately, and are ultimately, the biggest idol we have to deal with. Verse 11, now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. And in the outline, as the Lord was patient but also disciplinary with Israel, with the people under the Mosaic law, so it was for the Corinthians, and so it is for us as well. Think about that verse, though. These things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition. Well, yeah, but that was the God of the Old Testament, right? And the God of the Old Testament is different from the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament, he's all judgmental and smite them and burn them and kill them. But the God of the New Testament, he's all mercy and love and forgiveness and, right? Two completely different gods. And this verse clearly shows what is the case. He is not completely two different gods. It is God. Yes, there are different dispensations, but the things that happened to them back then happened as examples, and they were written down for who? For us. For our admonition. Specifically here for the Corinthians, as they were living under the new covenant. And it just flabbergasts you when people have the idea, well, the Old Testament God's different than the New Testament God. And you just want to say, have you not read Hebrews? Have you not read? Have you not read Scripture? And that we're still dealing with the same Lord. And we ought to be we should be real thankful, and we are thankful that the things that happened to them, they were written for our admonition. We can learn from them. The Old Testament was the tutor to bring them to Christ. We ought to be real thankful that we are living on this side of the cross. For one thing, because if we were living back then, what would we be? We're Gentiles. So we might think about, anyway, that idea. Verse 12. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And the Corinthians needed to take these things seriously as they were exhibiting the same issues. Pride was getting the best of them. They had started well, right? Chapter 6, you were sanctified, you were justified. They had started well. Paul, in talking about, he says, as a master craftsman, he had laid the foundation of Christ, and they had started well. But the Corinthians needed to take this seriously as these issues had arisen, and they needed to discipline themselves. As much as, we've harped on the fellow in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, they needed to discipline that guy. But by the time we get to chapter 11 and the Lord's Supper, and they're gathering to take the Lord's Supper, and Paul says, you're coming together, and it's not for the better, it's actually for the worse. Because when they came together, what were they not doing? They were not examining themselves. They were not disciplining themselves. And because of that, they were eating and drinking in an unworthy manner. And when he talks about it, and he says, for this reason, verse 30 of chapter 11, for this reason many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. We're talking about the same thing. We're talking about self-discipline. And part of self-discipline is self-denial, if not the same thing, but self-examination as well. All those things go hand in hand. The Corinthians, whoever thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. If you ask the Corinthians, we know what 1 John says. By this we know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. Love God and keep his commandments, right? So if you asked people the first half of that verse, therefore let him who thinks he stands. How many Christians think they stand? Right? We're supposed to have confidence, right? Come boldly before the throne of grace. Right? So how many Christians think they stand? Go ahead, Brace. You want to? Hopefully all of us. You think the Corinthians are any different? It's like they thought they were in the clear. They thought they were good, right? They thought they were good. But what was the truth of the situation? I think I've referenced this in sermons before. When you look at back to school again, you look at how nations are ranked in different things, like mathematics. You want to guess where America is ranked in mathematics? It's not very good. You want to guess where we are ranked in science? Not very good. And all of those things that we would hope to be near the top, we're actually not near the top. We're kind of down the list a little bit, except for the one category of confidence. You want to guess who's number one in confidence? We are. So what is it? Is it a justifiable confidence? Or is it actually a false sense of confidence? And that's where the Corinthians are, and that's where we can be as well. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed. So then the question is, okay, what do you take heed to? Take heed to yourself, take heed to the word, take heed to your brethren, take heed to the Lord. All of those things are going to come into play. And they're actually going to come into play with the next question. Verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Out of curiosity, verse 13, able to bear it. What are the other versions there? Endure it, right? I think sometimes when we see that, he will make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. What is the way of escape sometimes? Sometimes it's grit your teeth and bear it. It's not always, we know what other scriptures say. Resist the devil and what will he do? He'll flee from you. But sometimes David comes to Saul, right? In the David and Goliath account. When David and Saul is questioning him, and David says, when I see a lion, what do I do with it? Do I run away from it? He says, I deal with it. Paraphrased. When I see a bear, I deal with it. Sometimes, right, you're like Joseph. She grabs a hold of his cloak, and what does he do? He's out of there, and he leaves it in her hand. Is that always an option? Can you always, physically and literally, get out of that situation? No, sometimes what do you have to do? Sometimes you have to endure it. And does the Lord equip us to endure it? Right? That's the idea. With temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. The temptations that we face. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. Oh, how do you like it when people say, oh, I can't believe why this is happening to me. Why is this happening to me? Guess what? The same things that happen to you happen to who? We all face similar things. We all face issues of health. We all face issues that involve economics. We all face spiritual issues. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. Just refer back to that list all through chapter 10 right now. A lack of contentment. You don't think that affects everybody? Rich, poor, everybody. Idolatry and pride. That's everybody. Sexual immorality. Testing the Lord. Complaining. Does anyone think anybody has a monopoly on complaining? That's the one thing. If we were ranked worldwide, you know where we would be on that ranking? Folks are real good at complaining. God's people are supposed to be. We have, right? Godliness with contentment is great gain. Anyway, we should not think that we are special in what we are facing. And what we have to do is practice discipline and self-denial. And then we have the first application question on the outline. How does the Lord help us bear temptation? And I know that's a simple question, but I still think it's important. How does the Lord help us to bear temptation? What does he give us? Go ahead, Chuck. Then Ashley. You beat her by half a second. Do what?
We have each other as brothers and sisters.
We have each other. When the Lord's talking about that, and he says, those who have followed him now, and I'd have to find the verse. He doesn't even talk about, he talks about it in the future sense, but he also talks about it in the here and now sense, that they have found effectively family, again to paraphrase it. And it's like we have each other. It's like this is why the Lord built the church. This is why the Lord's body exists. According to so many passages, we're going to get to one here in a little bit in chapter 12, right? In talking about the body, that those who are weaker, those who are stronger, it's like we need one another. That's one of the problems with forsaking the assembly. Well, for any length of time, we need one another. And if we don't recognize that fact, hold on a second while I just think for a minute. The gift that the Corinthians were sending to Judea, when that is spoken about, let me see if I can find it. Look over in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. The gift that the Corinthians had planned and needed to be sending on to Judea. And I'd hate to just have to read 3 chapters to you. Just look back in chapter 8 at verse 13. For I do not mean that others, right? We've already spoken about the manna. This is manna language, and it's actually a quotation from the manna. Verse 13, for I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack. Right? Well, what were they lacking? There was a famine. They were lacking food. They needed help. They needed physical sustenance. That your abundance may supply their lack, but then all of a sudden, that their abundance also may supply your lack. Well, what were the Corinthians lacking? It's like, wait a minute, they had a surplus. Okay? That there may be equality. As it is written, he who gathers much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Anytime there's a giver, right? You have a giver and you have a receiver. And you have this idea of fellowship and this idea of sharing where it's not just one way. In helping the Judean saints were giving the Corinthians an opportunity. And it speaks about it in another place, and I was looking for a certain verse because it still calls it a grace, and I've turned away from it. But you have that idea of the Judean saints supplied what the Corinthians lacked. And what the Corinthians were lacking at that point was doing this work, frankly, and being a part, having fellowship in that. All that's to say this. When we think we don't need someone else, okay, right? We don't understand. We think we got it made. We got it made in the shade. And it's like, no. By helping them, they are actually helping us. By helping them and by edifying them, we have an opportunity. Is it more blessed to give or receive? Let's phrase it that way. That's a much easier way. John, why didn't you just put it like that to begin with? Is it more blessed to give or receive? It's more blessed to give. So if you're on the receiving end, well, you're on the opposite end. Now, you may have that need, and that needs to be fulfilled, but it's more blessed to give. So when the person who is able to give says, oh, well, I'm good, I don't need anything. No, you need to be blessed. So you give as you have opportunity. All that's to say we need one another. And if we forget that fact, we've forgotten the whole point of the church. We've forgotten why Jesus came to begin with. Go ahead, Chuck.
Needing each other. I mean, and that's where we need to open up to each other. We've all experienced sin and maybe something that we can help somebody else. The wise, couple, having, whether you have marriage issues or and that's where we need to know each other. That's why we need to be close to each other and know what we've experienced. And you know what? I'm here for. I know what it's like because I did go through that. And
it's like, how close should we be? How close should we be to one another? Well, one body, right? The hand cannot say, "I have no need of a foot." And it's like
when I hurt, I feel it.
If one member suffers, all the members suffer. If one rejoices, all rejoice. And if that's not how it is, then we have to work on that, right? That's how we should be. Ashley, you had your hand up for 1.5 seconds.
Learn from my mistakes. And, we do this with our children a lot. And I think the verse about take heed lest you fall, sometimes our kids will go to them and say, hey, look, I've been where you're at. I know exactly, where this leads to, where it goes. And they're like, oh, that's not me, or, I don't need that advice. And so, I think we as adults and Christians need to be careful when other Christians come to us and say, hey, I'm seeing some red flags. We need to have that soft heart and listen.
Yeah. We need one another. And think about, what has the Lord given us, right? He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with temptation will make the way of escape. How does the Lord help us to bear temptation? He gives us one another. He gives us his word. And it's like, I know, I hope you never look down on Bible study. We'll talk more about it Sunday, but we think about each other, and we think about God's word, we think about prayer, we think about all those things. We'll talk more about it. Appreciate everyone's help and attention.